To begin exploring the ideas presented in the passage, it's important to reflect on a key tension between human perception and divine presence throughout history. The passage highlights a moment from the reign of Philip II of Spain, where a proposal to improve human life through practical means, by making rivers navigable, was rejected on the grounds that it would challenge divine will. This rejection, though occurring centuries ago, sheds light on an enduring mindset that still shapes much of our thinking today. The tension between human agency and divine intention continues to influence our worldview, particularly in how we perceive God's presence in the modern world. Now, as we delve into the deeper implications of this, we will see how this historical perspective on God's involvement in the world contrasts with more contemporary understandings of divine presence, especially in the context of human solidarity and service. The correlation of our image of man and the world with our image of God. As long ago as the 2nd century, Justin wrote, "We Christians are called atheoi, and it is true. We are godless if what is meant by the word God is all kinds of pseudo-gods. Simply saying the word God does not in itself imply a religious sense, nor does not saying it imply the absence of religion or atheism. The word God caresses man's lips far less now than it did in the past. This is a fact, but it is important to understand what this silence means. This modern phenomenon has been called secularization, but this term is open to many different interpretations. It is up to us to evaluate the precise significance of the event taking place in our midst, which we are ourselves bringing about, and not immediately to call something that may, in fact, be a completely different event religious or irreligious. For example, a change in man's attitude towards his world. After all, analyzed in its primary and direct significance, so-called secularization is not relevant in the religious sense. Primarily and originally, this phenomenon is simply a basic change in man's attitude toward the world. In the past, nature was experienced by man as the reality that transcended him. Feeling either lost or secure, he was situated in this immense nature with its mysterious forces. It inspired him with reverence and awe. At the same time, it was also the gentle mother. That was why religious man was able to experience nature simply as numinous. Ancient man experienced God's anger or His blessing in the thunder and lightning, in the tempest and the blowing of the wind. It was in this that the Jews experienced their history of salvation. Nature was the direct reflection of Yahweh's kabod, His glory and splendor. The fact that man's work today has become entirely scientific and technical means that he no longer experiences nature in this sense in the world in which he lives, but in the sense of a nature transformed by himself into a world of man. The world in which man lives now has the luster, or lack of luster, of man himself, who has made it. The natural world, which in the past was directly experienced as divine and numinous, and which brilliantly displayed the vestigia Dei to man, has now been degraded by the increasingly scientific and technical work of modern society to the level of raw building material in the hands of creative man. The world of today is nature insofar as it bears the vestigia hominis, the traces, not of God, but of man. From being divinized nature, it has become the work of man's hands. The world now points to man. Even raw nature, the thunder and lightning, the tempest and the wind, makes modern man think at once of the technical resistance offered by the dikes and the efficiency of the lightning conductors that he has made himself. And even though man has really only just begun to conquer nature, he no longer lives in a nature by which he feels overwhelmed, or in which he feels secure and at home. He lives in a world that has been planned and produced by him, in which even raw nature has its special place in civilized society as a nature reserve. As a conqueror, man goes out to meet nature and forces it to its knees by means of technical supremacy. The modern Prometheus truly seizes fire from the sky. Nature no longer makes man think of the immense battle of a god against Leviathan, a battle in which primordial chaos was forced to become an ordered cosmos. The world in which we live today makes us think of man, who himself overcomes Leviathan. The Psalms, in which God's power is praised because of the glory of the sun, the moon, and the stars, are today dying away on men's lips. Stones, trees, and plants are no longer sacred places for him, in which God reveals himself. The direct, enthusiastic experience of the works of thy hands has now become a similarly direct, experience of the audacity of the works of man's hands, which is still only in its initial stages. Interpreted philosophically, this implies the degradation of nature, from being the subject to being the object of man's control. Man has, for his part, discovered his own being as a subject. This change from cosmocentrism to anthropocentrism means that the once theophanous world has now become a hominized world, in both the positive and the negative sense. The original datum that we discover if we analyze the Copernican revolution of our contemporary experience of life is not, in the first place, a religious or irreligious event, but simply a change in man's relationship with the world. As such, it is a purely profane event that is concerned with this world. It is a changed experience of the world and of his own existence. The world is no longer simply nature, but an entirety of relationships on man's part with the terrestrial forms of his existence. In confrontation with this world, man is discovered as the subject, the demiurge of his terrestrial form of existence. This is the original datum of the experience of secularization. Its philosophical implications are unmistakable, because the Copernican revolution is the counterpart of a process of demythologizing. In the ancient world, it was the logos that demythologized the mythos. It placed man in the center of the cosmos as the rational being who brought light into the primitive world of myth, thereby overcoming it. The logos that replaced myth at the time of the Greeks is now itself being overcome. It has become science and technology. Man is no longer the rational animal, the zoon logon ekon, who tries to fit his life rationally into the cosmic world order in which he is placed. He has become, for himself, the absolute subject, whose science and technology are able to transform his cosmic surroundings into the world. Many people experience this new interpretation of the world and of man directly as a crisis in their religious life. We can say, and are indeed bound to say, that they should not. But if we say this, we are misjudging the religious relevance of this event, which is not, as we have seen, the original datum, but a natural consequence of this datum. From the point of view of religious sociology, a certain correlation between the change in our image of man and the world and the movement away from the church is, at least, an exactly definable fact. This does not, however, provide us with any indication of the really correlative factors. The fact that French sociologists have established that there is a constant relationship between going to church every week and the possession of a bathroom at home does not point to any causal influence of the bathroom on regular church-going. It simply reveals that the practice of religion in France has been reduced by all kinds of historical, social, and economic factors to the fairly well-off middle class. This is also true of our problem. The relatively constant relationship between the movement away from the church and man's new understanding of himself does not yet show the really correlative poles. What is clear is that man's new experience of his own existence, with its desacralizing tendency as the expression of its humanizing element, gives rise to the temptation to call God a useless hypothesis. The ascertainment of this sociological fact suggests that there is a correlation between our image of man and the world and our image of God. This correlation is indeed present, theologically as well. After all, long before he begins to reflect, man experiences his existence in this world. This existence in the world is at the same time a thinking existence and therefore also, however sketchily, an understanding of self and a worldview in inseparable unity. Being with himself in human solidarity in this world is, moreover, the only door which gives man access to reality in its totality, since man cannot have at his disposal, in addition to his human existential experience, any other mysterious source of knowledge and consciousness of realities, including that of the God of creation or of revelation. There is no knowledge possible of realities of which no experience whatever is given. Since all human knowledge is based on perception, being consciously man in the world is man's only access to explicit consciousness, here and now of all other possible realities. I cannot therefore discover God either, unless he makes himself known to me in this world as the creator of this world, or by manifesting himself in grace and in the history of salvation in this world as the world of men. How could a divine revelation which was outside man's experience be heard? How, in other words, could it be a revelation to man? My being with myself in human solidarity in this world is then, of its very nature, the focal point within which God, too, becomes visible to me as the creator and the bringer of grace. And, what is more, I can only speak about the God of my salvation with the profane words, images, and concepts derived from my interpretation of myself and my worldview. The Christian faith and the Bible do not contain a single concept, which does not have a profane, human content as well. If this is so, then it is clear that any change in man's understanding of himself and of his world will, of its very nature, have repercussions on his image of God and on the whole of his relationship with God. The change in man's experience of the world as numinous nature to his experience of nature as inconsiderable but real building, material for creative human freedom also has, by definition, a religious relevance. This can be misinterpreted, and the new worldview can simply be experienced as the necessary casting out of all thought of God. Viewed critically, however, man's new worldview only means the casting out of the old image of God and the old forms of religion which were based on this, a becoming unreal of the empirical form in which the Church appears, the true theological interpretation of, and the directly raised response to, the phenomenon of secularization is therefore not disbelief, or the secularization of religion itself, but first and foremost a refusal to regard God as a factor within this world, the cornerstone of our universe, and a refusal to experience nature directly as numinous. Anyone who believes now in God the Creator knows that, precisely on the basis of the divine transcendence of this act of creation, God can only be present in the manner of absence, that He cannot be present as creatures are present for me, and that He can therefore only be present as the experienced horizon of creatural presence. Although this new existential experience does also give rise to an atheistic understanding of self, it is not in itself a denial of faith, but a removal from religion and the Church of those elements which religion had appropriated in a process of sacralization and had, in so doing, withdrawn from their original worldly profanity. This desacralization of the world does not mean, however, that God becomes unreal. It does mean that the so-called cosmological proofs of the existence of God become unreal, that God becomes unreal for modern man insofar as he is presented and preached in a cosmocentric image of man and the world. In this sense, it is more difficult for modern man still to see God in the world. He can no longer experience God, with Paul and the writers of the wisdom literature, as phaneron, as becoming as it were directly visible in the cosmos. In the older image of nature, it was virtually meaningless for man to deny the existence of God. His being in overwhelming, uncanny, and yet at the same time mild nature, his immediate evidence of life, would have been made completely absurd by it. But, in the framework of his contemporary worldview, man in the world preserves his profane values, even if he denies God. We may not underestimate this situation. Behind all the forms of contemporary atheism, there is a real experience, undoubtedly not of God's non-existence, but certainly of facts that can be recognized historically. A life without religion. I am not saying a life without God. That is not dependent on us ourselves, does not make man immoral, more stupid, or less human or personal. From the secular point of view, religion certainly does seem almost useless. It appears to yield no material result. Even without propaganda, it is here that atheism spontaneously attracts recruits. Atheists themselves therefore tend to regard history as an inevitable movement towards increasing universal atheism. Christians are bound to make a distinction here. They readily admit and even welcome the fact that history is inevitably moving towards increasing desacralization of the secular sphere. But on the other hand, they continue to regard atheism as an ideological interpretation of historical facts, which also retain their full value and meaning in a theistic and Christian perspective and do not require an atheistic interpretation in order to be meaningful. In the meantime, it is quite clear that a certain obscuring of God is undoubtedly the consequence of man's new understanding of himself and the world. For the believer, there is basically in this an intensified sense of God's being as something incomprehensible, unimaginable, and entirely transcendental, something which cannot be beheld and which is not of the world. God has been deprived of his image, and consequently, it is now more difficult directly to understand man himself as God's image. It is therefore possible for this situation to give rise increasingly to an atheistic explanation of existence, a phenomenon which, because of its present-day social dimension, makes clear and distinctly reveals what is possibly preying on the less accessible and obscure individual faith of all of us. The possibility of atheism, in all its forms, is essentially linked, on the one hand, with increasing secularity and thus with God's lack of standing in this world and, on the other, with the freedom of meaningful human existence. God cannot deny himself. That is, he cannot deny his transcendence over the world. He cannot, therefore, make his existence compellingly evident and manifest to human knowledge, not even in the human appearance of Jesus Christ. For the believer, however, secularization is an urgent call to experience authentic Christianity in a new way and in new forms. This does not mean that ancient or medieval Christians, living in a numinous world, experienced Christianity in a less authentically Christian way. What it does mean is that Christian authenticity itself passes through a history, and that contemporary authenticity of Christianity requires a critical attitude, not towards the ancient and medieval forms of religion which, because of their evident social context at the time, were then authentic, at least for people of that time, but towards the persistent clinging to patterns and forms, which cannot have any contemporary social setting for modern Christians and are consequently alien to life. Our new existential experience thus implies criticism of forms of religious experience derived from an earlier image of man in the world and, therefore, also from an outdated image of God. As the churches also have, institutionally, a communal aspect in which the religious attitude of their members is given a fixed form. It is obvious that the earlier religious attitude acquired, in the churches above all, a form that was, from the sociological point of view, hardly a supple one. It is consequently understandable that the process of secularization displays a correlation with the movement away from the churches. From the theological point of view, this does not mean, however, that belief and active adherence to the church are, in themselves, in conflict with man's new understanding of himself. But it does mean, of course, that they are in conflict with the outdated forms given to belief in the church. The movement away from the church as a statistical datum of sociology, therefore, tells us, in itself, nothing about unbelief or non-Christianity. From the theological point of view, however, it is undoubtedly a protest against the earlier forms of the church which modern man can no longer experience as a living reality and, therefore, for modern religious man, a demand for the aggiornamento of the church himself. But even this theological interpretation requires more subtle shading because, in religious experience, man's basic religious and Christian intention cannot be adequately distinguished from the church's or from explicit forms of expression of this intention. Although these two aspects are not identical, they are nonetheless, in experience, intimately. 1. One never experiences the basic implicit religious intention unless it is contained within images which represent it and express it, and which at the same time have a place in the valid image of man and the world. Criticism of the outdated forms in which the church appears, forms expressed in the movement away from the church, therefore also bears within itself the possibility that even the basic religious or Christian intention may become problematic, certainly insofar as it is explicit. In this respect too, secularization, which is to be welcomed from the point of view of faith, is not only a temptation to further movement away from the church, but also to abandon religion. It provides a new possibility of an atheistic or, at least with regard to God, a genuinely agnostic understanding of self in this world. Thus, however much we, as Christians, may welcome secularization, not only as people who are carried along by the current, but also as people who are urging it onward, we must at the same time have the courage honestly to admit that secularization does, in fact, make it more difficult for modern man to go on believing, to remain a Christian, and above all, to do this within the context of the church. The Christian faith will only be able to provide the modern world with solid guidance, again when a new type of Christianity has emerged, and the church has revealed its essential core in renewed, modern forms that are no longer alien to man's contemporary experience of the world and his own existence. The church must include this contemporary human experience in its understanding of what the church should be and, at the same time transcended in hope. Secularization, the change from a deified nature to a humanized world, is not a kind of necessary evil forced on believing man from outside, a situation that he must somehow handle as well or as poorly as possible. It is rather an inner consequence of Yahwism and Christianity, and, therefore, also an inner aspect of the historical evolution of Christianity itself. I do not wish to make a direct appeal to the fact that this secularization, originating in the West with its Christian history, will be irresistibly bound to spread to the whole world, thus constituting an almost fatal challenge to Oriental and African religions especially. The Christian confession of creation by a transcendent God is, at the same time, the fundamental affirmation of the secularity of reality. By definition, man in the world is, by virtue of this dogma of creation, non-divine. The one who is confined within specific limits. Their Yahwistic faith in creation led the Israelites, unlike their neighbors, to regard the sun, the moon, and the stars not as deified, numinous or sublime phenomena, but simply as ordinary lamps in the service of human day and night. It is only in history that all the implications of this fundamental desacralization of the world are revealed. The modern process of secularization, which began in a world, the history of which had been Christian, Russia and the West, has only gradually disclosed these implications in man's many-sided understanding of the world. We can see this process of desacralization taking place in the whole history of Christianity. Moreover, we can see it occurring not only outside conscious Christian reflection, but also when theologians or the magisterium of the Church explicitly oppose it in conscious reflection. This inner tendency is also given in Christianity, insofar as Christians believe in God as the Creator and hope for a new world as a definite possibility and as God's promise. This tendency may be checked, but ultimately, nothing can hold it back. Thus, we are able to see faith as reflection, theology, not only casting off the earlier, numinous cosmology in the course of history, but also giving encouragement and free scope, though not always without conflict, to the autonomous practice of psychology, sociology, and medicine, fields of knowledge that once carried a numinous coefficient. Indeed, we have even seen in our own times theology disowning ethics and recognizing this as something autonomously accessible to man as a being in the world with his fellow men. Western man takes to himself what is legitimately his, and this tendency is confirmed by theology. Faith reflecting about itself, in the light of its own insights into faith, even though this theological confirmation may sometimes come a little late.